Tonight, we're going to talk about something that will probably keep you awake, ironically enough. Or maybe it'll finally let you sleep. It's hard to say which. It's the year 1985, and in a dimly lit archive at Johns Hopkins University, an American historian named Roger Ukach is doing what historians do. He's hunched over a table stacked with brittle 400-year-old court records, squinting at faded ink, breathing in that particular smell that old parchment gets when it's been sitting in a vault for centuries. He's not looking for anything in particular. He's researching nighttime in pre-industrial England, which is already kind of a strange topic when you think about it. Nobody really writes histories of the dark. Historians write about kings and battles and revolutions, the things that happen in the light of day. But Ukach is curious about what people actually did once the sun went down, and so he's reading depositions, criminal trials, diaries, prayer books, anything he can find that mentions the hours between dusk and dawn. And that's when he starts noticing it. A phrase. Just a few words, casually dropped into a witness statement or a personal letter, always without any explanation, as if the writer assumed the reader already knew what they meant. First sleep. Sometimes it's spelled a bit differently, sometimes it's in Latin as primo sumner, sometimes in French as premier summel. A servant testifies that she was attacked after her first sleep. A priest writes in his journal that he prayed at the end of his first sleep. A man is murdered during his first sleep. Over and over and over, in document after document, this phrase appears. And nobody, not one single writer, ever bothers to define what a first sleep actually is. Now, you or I might read that and just assume it means, the first time you fell asleep that night. Big deal. But Ukach is a historian, and he knows better. When a phrase shows up thousands of times across multiple centuries and multiple languages, all being used in exactly the same casual way, it means something specific. It's a piece of shared knowledge so common that it doesn't need explaining. Like if I said, I had my morning coffee. You wouldn't need me to define what a morning coffee is. Everyone knows. And that, right there, is the mystery. Because whatever a first sleep was, everyone in Europe knew about it for hundreds of years. And then, within maybe 2 or 3 generations, we all completely forgot. Completely. Erased from cultural memory as if it had never existed at all. So the question is, how do we sleep? Or rather, how did we used to sleep? What did the human night actually look like before we flipped a switch and made it disappear? Before we begin, allow me to welcome you to the channel. Hello to any newcomers. I invite you to subscribe if you've not done so, and I also invite you to boost us up in the algorithm if you would take the time to leave a comment, click the like and hype buttons. Always helps. It's the best way to support the channel. And supporting the channel is important because, as you've noticed, we don't have any ads on any of our videos. This is because we are supported by the kind people on Patreon, YouTube memberships, those who check out the merch store, and the donation links on YouTube and PayPal. All the appropriate links can be found in the channel video and descriptions. Navigate to them if you feel inclined to do so. And now, without further ado, introductions and shameful e-begging out of the way, let us begin this strange journey into the lost country of the pre-industrial night. Now, back to Ukach. He's got this phrase, first sleep, and he can't let it go. Once you notice something like that, you can't unnups it. So he starts pulling threads, looking for anywhere else these words might appear. He digs into medical texts. He digs into poetry. He digs into homilies and confession manuals and household guides. And what he finds is that the phrase is absolutely everywhere, not just in England, but across the entire Western world. There are references in Homer, of all people, writing in ancient Greece. There are references in Virgil. There are references in Chaucer, in Cervantes, in the Old Testament. And bit by bit, an outline begins to emerge. First sleep, it turns out, is only the first sleep because there was, apparently, a second sleep. 2 distinct periods of rest, separated by a wakeful interval in the middle of the night. And that interval, that mysterious gap in the middle of the dark, had its own name too. In English, they called it the watch. In French, devoir from dummer, to sleep, and volker, to be awake. A sleep-waking. A conscious space carved out of the dead of night, and no one knew about it anymore, at least in the modern age. Ukach spends the next 16 years, mind you, chasing this phrase across every archive he can access. He publishes a paper about it in 2001 in the American Historical Review. He follows it with a book called At Day's Close, which comes out in 2005. And by the time he's finished, he's collected more than 500 references to segmented sleep from sources spanning over 2,000 years of European history. Court testimony, medical guides, ballads, novels, letters, sermons, even old wives' remedies for insomnia, which tellingly are all about how to fall back asleep during the watch, not how to sleep through the night in one long block, because nobody expected to sleep through the night in one long block. That wasn't the human default. That was a thing that came later. That was a thing that was invented. And here's where it gets a little uncomfortable if you think about it too hard. Because everything we assume about sleep, and I mean everything, the 8 solid hours, the single block from lights out until the alarm goes off, the idea that waking up at 3 in the morning means something is wrong with you, that you have insomnia, that you need to see a doctor or take a pill or download an app, all of that, apparently, is a modern invention. A very, very recent modern invention. For most of human history, people did not sleep the way we sleep. And they didn't just do it slightly differently. They did it fundamentally differently, with a whole cultural architecture built around the space in between. So what did it actually look like? What did a normal night in, say, the 1690s actually feel like from the inside? Well, imagine you're a weaver in a small English town. Say your name is Mugrat, and you live above your workshop with your husband, and let's say 3 children, all crammed into 2 rooms, because that's how people lived back then. It's late autumn. The sun goes down at maybe 4 in the afternoon, and by 6 it's completely dark, that thick, absolute dark that we don't really experience anymore unless we go camping somewhere very far from any city. There is no ambient glow from streetlights, no orange smudge on the horizon from a nearby town. When it gets dark in 1695, it gets dark, properly dark. The kind of dark where you can hold your hand in front of your face and not see it. Now Mugrat and her family, they don't just stay up till 11 watching television because there is no television and also because they can't. Candles are expensive. Really, really expensive. A single tallow candle, which is the cheap kind made from animal fat, could cost the equivalent of maybe an hour or 2 of a Lubka's wages, and it wouldn't even burn for a full evening. Beeswax candles, the good ones that didn't smell like burning fat and didn't smoke as much, those were luxury goods, reserved for churches and the very wealthy. So burning an hour of candlelight for an ordinary family meant burning hours of Lubk, and that math simply doesn't add up. It's cheaper to just go to bed. So Mugrat and her husband, after they've eaten their evening meal, probably some kind of pottage, because we talked about pottage in that medieval winter episode, they say their prayers, they check on the children who are already tucked up together in one bed for warmth, and then they bank the fire. Now, banking the fire is a whole ritual in itself, and it comes with a very interesting piece of vocabulary. You cover the burning embers with ash to keep them alive but smothered, so they won't blaze up and burn the house down while everyone's asleep. And the metal or clay cover that you place over the coals to do this was called, in Norman French, a couvre-feu. Literally, fire cover. Say that out loud a few times. Couvre-feu. Curfew. Yeah. That word that we now use to mean the time you have to be inside by, or the time when a city goes into lockdown, that word originally just meant, put a lid on your fire so you don't burn down the neighborhood, and by the way, it's time for bed. That was medieval bedtime signaling. The bell would ring in the town, and everybody knew, cover your fires. It's time. So Mugrat covers the fire. The room goes almost completely dark, just a faint red glow through the ash. She climbs into bed beside her husband, pulls the woolen blankets up, and within minutes, probably, she's asleep. Because remember, she's been working since dawn. She's been up for 12 or 13 hours doing physical labke. Sleep comes fast, and this first sleep, this initial descent into unconsciousness, is deep. It's the heavy, dreamless kind of sleep that our modern selves rarely experience because we spend our evenings staring at glowing rectangles that trick our brains into thinking it's still daytime. Mugrat's brain has no such confusion. When it gets dark, her body understands. Sleep, now, fully, and so she does. But then, sometime around midnight, or maybe 1 in the morning, something happens. Her eyes open. She's not startled awake. She's not anxious. She just wakes up. And so does her husband beside her. And so, all across the town, do their neighbors. And so, all across England, do thousands upon thousands of other people. Because it is time now for the watch. So Mugrot opens her eyes in the dark, and here's the thing you have to understand. She is not confused. She is not distressed. She does not reach for her phone to check the time, obviously, because that's 400 years away, but she also doesn't panic and think, oh no, I've woken up in the middle of the night. Something must be wrong. I'll never get back to sleep. I have to be up in 5 hours. This is a disaster. None of that internal monologue that we modern people run through when we wake up at 3 in the morning. She simply wakes up, because this is supposed to happen. This is the watch. This is her time. And what does she do with it? Well, that depends entirely on Mugrot, and that's actually the most beautiful part of this whole story, in my opinion. The watch was not a scheduled activity. It was not a communal event, though sometimes it became one. It was, essentially, an hour or two of unstructured, private time in the middle of the night, and people used it for whatever they felt like using it for. Which, when you think about our modern lives, is actually a kind of freedom we don't have anymore. When during your day in the modern world, do you have an hour or two of completely unstructured time where you are not being asked to do anything, produce anything, entertain anything, respond to anything? Probably never. And yet our ancestors had this every single night, for free, baked into the fabric of the human night itself. So Mugrot, being a devout woman of the 1690s, probably prays. This was, in fact, one of the most common uses of the watch, and it's actually where a lot of untouched evidence comes from. Devotional manuals of the medieval and early modern period contained specific prayers designed for what they called the middle of the night. The 15th century French monk Jean Jusson wrote about the deep spiritual value of the watch, arguing that the mind was clearer then than at any other time of day, uncluttered by the noise and business of waking life. There's a whole tradition of what were called nocturnal prayers or night offices, and while these were most rigorously observed in monasteries, where monks literally got up in the middle of the night to sing the office of matins, they filtered down into lay culture too. Ordinary people prayed during the watch. They contemplated their sins. They thought about God. They lay in the dark and did the kind of slow, unhurried spiritual reflection that our modern lives make almost impossible. Some people used the watch to interpret their dreams, and this was taken very seriously indeed. See, dreams from the first sleep were considered particularly meaningful because you'd just woken up from them. They were fresh. You could still remember them clearly. And the medieval and early modern worldview didn't really distinguish between dreams and messages in the way we do. A dream might be a warning from God, a visitation from a dead relative, a premonition of things to come, or just a manifestation of your bodily humors being out of balance, which, if you remember from the previous video, was a whole medical framework people took quite seriously. So Mugrot might lie there in the dark, running through her dream, wondering what it meant, whether she should tell her husband, whether she should mention it to the priest on Sunday. And speaking of her husband, well, this is where it gets interesting. Because one of the most consistent recommendations in medieval and early modern medical literature was that the watch, that quiet interval between the two sleeps, was the ideal time for married couples to conceive children. This is not me speculating. This is written down in medical manual after medical manual. A 16th century French physician named Laurent Joubert argued that couples who tried to conceive immediately upon going to bed, when they were exhausted from the day's labeur, were doing themselves a disservice. Far better, he wrote, to wait until after the first sleep, when the body had rested, the humors had settled, and both partners were refreshed. He even suggested that children conceived in this state were healthier, hapak, and more likely to be, quote, well-formed and pleasant of disposition. Whether that's true or not, well, that's a whole other discussion. But the point is that this was normal, accepted, expected. The watch was for prayer, yes, but it was also for intimacy. And the practical reality of that, in a household where 5 people slept in 2 rooms, well, I'll let you draw your own conclusions about the logistics. Other people used the watch for conversation. Just plain old talking. Akach found accounts of couples discussing the day's events, planning the next day's work, gossiping about neighbors, ugwang about money, all in the dark, at 1 in the morning, while the coals hissed under their ash. Parents would sometimes get up and check on children who had woken. Older siblings would sometimes talk quietly to younger siblings in the same bed. It was, in many ways, the most intimate hour of the household's day, because it was the only hour when nobody was busy, nobody was demanded elsewhere, nobody was being asked to do anything. Just being together in the dark, alive. And then there were the more active uses of the watch, and this is where you start to realize that the pre-industrial night was actually a lot buzzer than you might think. Mugrat might get out of bed. She might light a single rush light, which is a cheaper alternative to a candle made from a length of reed duppered in fat that burns for about 20 minutes and gives off just enough light to see by if you're right next to it. And with that light, she might do small tasks. Mending a torn stocking, checking on the fire, feeding a baby. Some women used the watch to do quiet handwork that didn't require much light, or to check on brewing beer or rising dough. Farmers used it to check on the animals. There's a wonderful 17th century account of a Yorkshire farmer who used the watch every night to walk out to the barn and see how the cows were doing, then come back to bed. He wrote that he found it, quote, the most peaceful hour of the 4 and 20. Some people went visiting. This surprised me when I first read about it. But yes, apparently it was reasonably common for people, especially in rural areas, to actually leave their homes during the watch and walk to a neighbor's house. Now, obviously, this required some coordination and some prearrangement. You couldn't just knock on someone's door at 2 in the morning uninvited. But if you and your neighbor had agreed to meet, say, to swap gossip or share news or talk about a particular problem, the watch was actually a decent time to do it. Akach describes accounts of women in particular using this time to visit each other, especially during pregnancy or illness, when they needed comfort or advice. There's a diary entry from a Suffolk midwife who describes being called out 3 separate times during the watch on the same night to attend to different women in different stages of labkha, and it's clear from her tone that this was completely routine. She wasn't complaining about being woken up. She was simply describing her Wednesday. And on nights when the moon was full or nearly full, the watch could actually be quite bright. This is another thing we've forgotten in the age of electric light. But a full moon on a clear night, especially with snow on the ground, is remarkably illuminating. You can see well enough to walk paths, read faces, even do certain kinds of outdoor work. Farmers in the medieval and early modern periods actually planned tasks around the lunar calendar for exactly this reason. A full moon night in winter, when the fields were frozen solid, was sometimes used for hauling timber or moving livestock, because you got extra hours of usable light. And during the watch on such nights, people might genuinely go outside just to look at things. The world at midnight under a full moon is a strange and beautiful place, and our ancestors knew it intimately in a way that we simply don't. Then there were the watchmen. Every town of any size in medieval and early modern Europe had a night watch, a rotating group of men whose job it was to patrol the streets during the dark hours, looking out for fires, thieves, disturbances, and generally keeping the peace. In England, the office of the Constable of the Watch dated back to the 13th century. These men would walk their appointed routes carrying a lantern, a staff, and sometimes a bell or horn, calling out the hours as they went. 12 o'clock and all's well. That famous phrase actually comes from this tradition, and it wasn't just a rhetorical flourish. It was a public service announcement. If the watchman called out all's well, it meant no fires had broken out, no crimes had been reported, everything was in order. You can go back to your second sleep in peace. If he called out something different, well, then things might be less well, and you might want to get up and see what was happening. So the watch, this magical wakeful hour in the middle of the night, was not silent, was not lonely, was not empty. It was populated. People were praying, people were loving, people were talking, people were mending, people were walking to their neighbors, people were being called out to deliver Barbies, watchmen were patrolling the streets calling out the time. The pre-industrial night was its own country, with its own citizens, its own laws, and its own etiquette. And the etiquette, this is important, was that the night was a private space. You didn't intrude on it uninvited. You didn't knock on doors at random. You didn't burst in on people during the watch and demand things of them. There was an unspoken agreement that this hour belonged to the individual and to the household, and that it was not to be violated except in emergencies. And here's the thing that Akach really drives home in his work. This was not a marginal phenomenon. This was not something that just a few weird eccentrics did. This was, apparently, how essentially everyone in Europe slept for well over 1,000 years. Kings and queens did it. Peasants and paupers did it. Monks did it formally as part of their religious discipline. Doctors described it as normal and healthy. Poets wrote poems about it. Playwrights had characters describe waking up during the watch as casually as we might describe grabbing a glass of water in the middle of the night. It was, quite simply, how the human night worked. And then, at some point, it stopped. And within a couple of generations, everyone forgot it had ever been any different. So let's go back to Mugrot, because I want you to really feel this, not just understand it intellectually. Let's stay with her for a moment longer, because this is the part that changes how you think about sleep forever once you've properly sat with it. It's around 1:30 in the morning now. She's been awake for maybe half an hour. Her husband is awake beside her, quietly, and they've been talking in low voices about a debt they're owed by a customer who keeps putting off payment. It's the kind of low-stakes household conversation that fills the watch in so many diaries and letters from the period. Not dramatic, not urgent. Just the stuff of a shared life being sorted through in the dark. But now Mugrot has decided she wants to visit her neighbor Alice, who lives about 4 doors down the same street. Alice's mother died 3 weeks ago, and Alice has been struggling. Mugrot and Alice agreed the day before that Mugrot would come by during the watch tonight, because Alice can't sleep anyway, and the daytime hours are too full of children and work, and the constant demands of running a household to really talk properly. So Mugrot slips out of bed. She pulls a woolen shawl over her nutshaft, wraps a second one around her head and shoulders, and steps into a pair of leather shoes that live by the bed for exactly this purpose. She doesn't need to dress properly. Nobody's going to see her, and even if they do, everyone's in some version of the same state. Nightwear in the watch is not scandalous. Nightwear in the watch is just what people wear during the watch. She opens the door as quietly as she can and steps out onto the street. And here's what I want you to imagine. The street is not empty. It's not busy, obviously. It's not like the daytime, but it's not deserted either. There's a watchman about 50 yards up the road, lantern swinging, doing his round. There's a light in the window of the baker's house because bakers start their work in the very early hours, kneading dough for the morning bread. There's a cat sitting on a low wall watching everything with that particular contempt that cats reserve for the world at large. And the moon, tonight, is about 3/4 full, high in a mostly clear sky, and the whole street is bathed in this soft silver light that makes everything look like it's slightly underwater. Mugrot can see her way perfectly well. She doesn't need a lantern. She walks the 50 feet to Alice's door, taps 3 times, softly in a pattern they agreed on, and Alice opens the door immediately because she was waiting. Inside Alice's kitchen, the fire is banked, but there's a small pot of something warm on the hearth, some kind of herbal infusion, maybe with a bit of honey. Alice pours 2 cups. They sit at the wooden table and they talk. Alice cries. Mugrot listens. They talk about Alice's mother, about the funeral, about the practical arrangements that still need sorting, about Alice's father, who has become withdrawn and difficult since his wife's death. They talk for about 40 minutes. Then Mugrot hugs Alice, promises to come again in 3 days at the same time, and walks back home through the moonlit street. The watchman nods at her as she passes. She lets herself back into her own house, slips off the shoes, hangs up the shawl, climbs back into bed beside her husband, who has drifted into a light doze, and within a few minutes she's asleep again. Second sleep, deep and easy. She will wake with the dawn refreshed, and she will remember all day the good she did by going to see Alice, and she will feel that particular satisfaction of having used the watch well. That is a normal Tuesday night in 1695. Not exceptional. Not particularly notable. That is just what a night was. And when you sit with that image for a while, when you really let it settle, I think it starts to feel almost impossibly rich compared to the way we do nights now. We treat night as an obstacle, a gap, a period of unconsciousness we have to get through in order to get to the next day. Mugrut treated night as a place, a whole country with its own texture and its own uses and its own kinds of intimacy. And she wasn't unusual in any of this. She was doing what everyone did, the way everyone did it. Now, before we move on, I want to give you a few more concrete examples of the watch from actual historical sources, because I think it helps to know this really did happen, and I'm not just making it up. In 1595, a physician named Indrabutta wrote a health manual in which he casually advised his readers that the best posture for sleep was to lie first on the right side, then to turn onto the left side after the first sleep, before the second sleep began. He assumed his readers would understand exactly what he meant. He didn't feel the need to explain it. In 1616, the poet George Wither wrote a poem that includes the line, "And oft times, in my first sleep, mine eye did close." Again, casual, unexplained. A 17th century English legal deposition from a case Ukach found in the records describes a servant girl who was assaulted, quote, in the Dada Tama betwixt her first and second sleep. The lawyer didn't need to define this. The judge didn't need it defined. The jury didn't need it defined. Everyone in that courtroom knew exactly what the Dada Tama was, and it wasn't the middle of the night in some vague sense. It was specifically the interval between the two sleeps. Chaucer, in the 14th century Canterbury Tales, has one of his characters go to bed and rise after her first sleep, then have a conversation, then return to bed. Savantas, in Don Quixote, published in 1605, describes Sancho Panza sleeping his first sleep, waking, doing something, and then going back for his second. Homer, in the Odyssey, from perhaps 800 BCE, describes characters rising in the middle of the night after their first sleep. That's how far back this goes. Nearly 3,000 years of documented biphasic sleep across the Western literary tradition, and it's not confined to the West either. Similar patterns show up in African cultures that anthropologists studied in the 20th century, in traditional communities in the Amazon, in some parts of South Asia. Anywhere people lived without artificial light, the night tended to break itself naturally into two halves. And here's a detail I find particularly wonderful. The Latin term for the interval, sometimes used in medieval church writings, was in Tempusta Nox, the untimely night, the night out of time. As if the watch existed in some kind of temporal parenthesis, a suspension of the normal flow of hours, a hidden garden between the two proper sleeps where the ordinary rules of day and night didn't quite apply. Church writers debated whether the watch was a holy time, uniquely suited to prayer and contemplation, because the mind was quiet and the world was still, or whether it was a dangerous time, when demons and evil spirits were most active and the soul was most vulnerable. Depending on which theologian you asked, you got different answers, but everyone agreed that it was a distinct time, with its own character, that had to be understood and navigated carefully. Now, one question that comes up a lot when people first hear about this, and it's a fair question, is whether people were actually getting enough sleep this way. Because if you break your sleep into two chunks with a wakeful hour in the middle, aren't you going to be exhausted the next day? And the answer, based on both the historical evidence and, as we'll see later, modern scientific studies, is no, not at all. In fact, quite the opposite. People sleeping bafusakti appear to have been well rested, cognitively sharp, and generally functioning at a high level, because the total sleep time was actually longer than what most modern people get. Mugrut would have gone to bed around 8 or 9 in the evening. Her first sleep would last maybe 4 or 5 hours. The watch would be 1 to 2 hours. Then her second sleep would be another 3 or 4 hours. She's getting somewhere between 7 and 9 hours of actual sleep, plus a wakeful, restorative interval in the middle that seems to have functioned almost like a mental reset. Not a bad system, when you think about it. Actually, kind of a brilliant system. And this, I think, is the part that starts to raise some uncomfortable questions about the way we live now. Because most of us, if we're honest, are not getting anywhere near 7 to 9 hours of sleep, and we're not experiencing anything like a restorative wakeful interval either. We're getting 6 hours or 5 or 4 in one anxious block, and then we spend our days topping ourselves up with caffeine and pretending we feel fine. And when we do wake in the middle of the night, which many of us do, we treat it as a pathology. We call it insomnia. We take pills for it. We worry about it. We check our phones and make the problem worse by exposing our eyes to blue light. And then we lie there anxious and frustrated for the hour or two it takes us to fall back asleep, if we fall back asleep at all. Which, when you know what Mugrat was doing at the same time of night 400 years ago, starts to feel like something has gone quite badly wrong. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Because Mugrat's world, this world of first sleeps and second sleeps, of watchmen calling the hour, of the Kavafya bell ringing at dusk and moonlit visits between neighbors, this world doesn't disappear all at once. It gets worn down gradually, over about 150 years, by a series of technological changes that seem, individually, like obvious improvements. Nobody sat down and said, right, let's abolish the second sleep. Let's stamp out biphasic rest across all of European civilization within 3 generations. It just happened. One innovation at a time, one lamp at a time, one factory shift at a time, until suddenly the whole architecture of the human night had been rebuilt. And by the time anyone thought to notice what had been lost, everyone who remembered the old way was dead. So how does a thing that lasted for 2 or 3,000 years just disappear? How does something as fundamental as the shape of human sleep get quietly overcrutted in a couple of generations? The answer, and it's an answer that keeps coming up in the history of the modern world, is light. Artificial light. More of it, cheaper, brighter, easier, and eventually, absolutely everywhere. And the first big step in that direction, the one that started chipping away at Mugrat's world, happened in a place that might surprise you. Not a factory. Not a research laboratory. A coffee house. Let me set the scene. It's the 1660s in London. Charles II has been restored to the throne. The plague has just torn through the city. The Great Fire is either about to happen or has just happened depending on which year we're looking at, and a new kind of establishment is spreading through the streets. Coffee houses. Places where men, and it was almost exclusively men, could gather to drink this strange, bitter new beverage from the Ottoman Empire, argue about politics, read the newspapers, do business, and generally stay out much later than anyone had traditionally stayed out before. And these places were lit. Not brilliantly, by our standards, but well enough. Multiple candles, oil lamps, the fire in the hearth. The kind of light that lets you read a broadsheet at 10 in the evening, which was, at the time, a genuinely novel experience for most people. Reading after dark had been, for most of history, a luxury of the very rich or the very devout. Now it was becoming something a middling merchant could do over a cup of coffee. And around the same time, a related change was happening in the streets themselves. Starting in Paris in 1667, and then in London a few years later, and then spreading gradually to other major European cities, we get the invention of organized street lighting. It's important to say what this actually was, because it wasn't anything like what we mean now. It was oil lamps, hung on hooks or posts, lit at dusk by paid lamplighter's, and refueled every day or two. The light they gave off was faint, yellow, flickering, and vastly less impressive than a modern LED streetlight. But it was continuous, it was public, and it fundamentally changed what the streets of a European city looked like after dark. Before, the streets were nearly pitch black except on moonlit nights, and anyone out on them without a personal lantern was assumed to be up to no good. After, there was a soft glow along the main thoroughfares, and it became possible, for the first time in urban history, for ordinary people to move around the city at night for ordinary purposes. Going to a coffee house, going to a theater, which was another new institution starting to develop evening performances, going to a friend's house for a dinner that ran past sunset. And this, subtly at first, started to shift the shape of the evening. If you can be out until 10 or 11 at night, you're going to bed later. If you're going to bed later, your first sleep is starting later. And if your first sleep is starting later, the watch, which used to happen at midnight or 1 in the morning, is now happening at 2 or 3 in the morning, which is much harder to sustain because you have to be up for work in the morning. So gradually, imperceptibly, the two sleeps started to compress. The first sleep got shorter. The watch got shorter. The second sleep got shorter. And for the wealthiest urban dwellers, the ones who could afford to burn candles late into the evening and who had social lives that ran on the new schedule of the coffee house and the theatre, biphasic sleep started to become something they mentioned less and less often. Now, I want to be careful here because this was a slow process. It didn't happen everywhere at once. Peasants in rural France or Germany or Spain in 1700 were still sleeping the way mugrats slept. They still had their first sleep and their second sleep and their watch, because they didn't have coffee houses. They didn't have street lamps. They didn't have social lives that ran late into the evening. Their nights were still governed by the sun and the fire and the couvre-feu bell. But in the cities, and specifically among the middle and upper classes in the cities, the change was starting to bite. And where the cities went, over the next century, the countryside would eventually follow. The next big shove came with gaslight, and this is where things really start to accelerate. Gas lighting was developed in the late 18th century, first as a curiosity, and then increasingly as a practical technology for lighting factories and public spaces. In 1807, a stretch of Pall Mall in London became the first public street in the world to be lit by gas lamps. The effect was reportedly astonishing. People traveled from all over the country to come and stare at it. A whole street lit up brightly enough that you could read a newspaper standing under any of the lamps. This was a level of illumination that no European city had ever experienced before, and it changed something in the human relationship with the night in a way that oil lamps hadn't quite managed, because oil lamps just made the darkness slightly less dark. Gas lamps actually pushed the darkness back. There were pools of genuine light now, in the middle of the city, at midnight, and you could walk through them and see things almost as clearly as you could in the daytime. Within 20 years of that first Pall Mall installation, gas lighting had spread to most major European and American cities. And more importantly, it moved indoors. Gas lighting in the home, which started to become affordable for middle-class households from about the 1820s and 1830s onward, meant that for the first time in human history, ordinary people could have bright, sustained, cheap indoor light for hours after sunset. And this changed everything. Because now you could read comfortably after dark. You could sew. You could keep the accounts. You could entertain guests until midnight without going broke on candles. The evening, which had been a small compressed thing squeezed between sunset and the first sleep, expanded into a whole new social and intellectual space. Dinner parties moved later. Novels got read in the evening rather than during snatched daylight hours. Family life reorganized itself around the illuminated parlor. And bedtime, inexorably, kept getting pushed back. And now we get to the factories, because the factories are actually the darker side of this same story. The Industrial Revolution didn't just change how things were made. It changed how time worked for the people who made them. Before the factories, most work was governed by daylight and by the seasons. Peasants and craftsmen worked when they could work, rested when they needed to rest, and their days had a rhythm that flowed with the natural world. But a factory doesn't care about daylight. A factory cares about production. And once you can light a factory floor with gas lamps, and later with electric lights, there's no reason at all not to run the factory around the clock, which is exactly what factory owners started doing. Shift work is the invention here, and it's an invention that has done more to warp the human relationship with sleep than perhaps any other single innovation. When you have workers coming in for a shift at 6 in the morning, and other workers coming in at 2 in the afternoon, and a third shift coming in at 10 at night, you cannot have those workers taking a watch in the middle of their sleep. They need to sleep in one solid block, whenever their shift schedule allows them to sleep, and they need to be able to fall asleep on command and wake on command and function on command. The biphasic pattern, which had suited agricultural life beautifully, was catastrophically incompatible with industrial life. And so, in the factory towns of England and Belgium and Germany and the American Northeast, workers were essentially forced, by the shape of their working lives, to consolidate their sleep into a single block. They didn't have time for a watch. They had to get up at 5 in the morning, and they had gone to bed at 10 the night before, and the 7 hours in between had to be one solid unit of unconsciousness, because there was no room for anything else. And here's the cultural piece that came alongside this economic pressure. In the 18th and 19th centuries, a new attitude towards sleep started to develop among the educated classes of Europe and America. Sleep, which had for so long been treated as a natural and necessary part of life, started to be described in more and more negative terms. It was a waste of time. It was a form of idleness. It was, and I'm quoting from actual 18th and 19th century sources here, quote, a partial death, or a foretaste of the grave. Benjamin Franklin famously advised, early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise, which sounds folksy and harmless until you realize it's actually a piece of ideology. It's telling you that the good and virtuous person spends as little time as possible in bed. That sleep is something you should minimize. That anyone who lies in bed for extended periods, or, God forbid, gets up in the middle of the night to sit quietly with their own thoughts is failing to be productive and therefore failing morally. This was a genuinely new idea, historically speaking. Medieval and early modern culture didn't view sleep this way. Sleep was a gift from God. It was necessary. It was healing. The idea that a virtuous person should sleep as little as possible would have struck Mugrut's world as, frankly, deranged. Why would you want less of a good thing? But by the middle of the 19th century, this attitude was becoming dominant in the industrializing West. Sleep was for the lazy. The productive person maximized their waking hours. And if you happen to wake up in the middle of the night with an hour or two of dreamy consciousness on your hands, well, that was a sign of some kind of nervous disorder, wasn't it? A sign that you needed treatment. Because the healthy modern person, the useful modern person, slept straight through, from lights out to alarm clock, in a single efficient block. And if you didn't, there was something wrong with you. And then, in 1879, Thomas Edison patented a working incandescent light bulb, and everything changed forever. Now, I want to be a little careful here, because Edison didn't invent electric light from nothing. There were earlier arc lamps, there were experimental bulbs by other inventors, and the specific claim that Edison invented the light bulb is one of those historical simplifications that scholars love to argue about. But what Edison did do, and this is what actually matters for our story, was create the first commercially viable, mass-producible, affordable electric light bulb, along with the entire infrastructure needed to make electric lighting practical in ordinary homes and streets. The Edison Electric Light Company started stringing wires and installing generators in New York City in the early 1880s, and within a decade, electric lighting had gone from a scientific curiosity to a feature of everyday urban life in the United States and Europe. And within another 2 decades, it was in the homes of ordinary middle-class families. And Edison, this is the part I want you to sit with, Edison had opinions about sleep. Strong opinions. He was famously proud of sleeping only 3 or 4 hours a night himself, and he considered this a mark of superior character. He would take short naps during the day, curled up on a workbench or under a desk, and he thought most people could function perfectly well on the same schedule if they only had the discipline to try. In interviews and public statements throughout his career, Edison described sleep in terms that ranged from dismissive to actively contemptuous. He called it a heritage from our cave days, a waste of time, a bad habit. In one famous 1914 interview, he predicted that as electric lighting became more universal, humans would gradually need less and less sleep, and would eventually evolve into a species that slept perhaps 2 or 3 hours a night, spending the rest of the time on useful, productive activity. This, he believed, would be a great advance for civilization. We now know, from about a century of subsequent research, that Edison was almost entirely wrong about this. Human beings need 7 to 9 hours of sleep, on average, and depriving ourselves of that sleep causes measurable harm to our cognitive function, our physical health, our emotional regulation, and our long-term life expectancy. Edison himself, incidentally, appears to have been getting more sleep than he claimed. His famous 3-hour nights were supplemented by extensive daytime napping, so his actual total sleep time was probably closer to normal. He just distributed it differently and lied about it in interviews to seem more impressive. But the ideology he championed, the idea that sleep is fundamentally wasteful and that a truly productive modern person should minimize it, that ideology took hold in American and European culture in a way that it has never really let go of. We still talk about sleep this way. We still admire the executive who runs on 4 hours a night. We still treat rest as an indulgence rather than a necessity. And Edison's light bulb, more than any other single invention, made his ideology practically enforceable. Because once you have electric light in your home, the natural constraints on your evening simply disappear. You are no longer governed by candles, by oil, by gas, by the price of any of these things. Flip a switch. Read until midnight. Sew until 1 in the morning. Do your accounts. Have a conversation. Have a party. The night, as a fundamental fact of human biology and human culture, ceases to exist in the way it existed for Mugrat. There is no more cover fire. There is no more banking the fire. There is no more moment of transition where the day ends and the darkness begins and you climb into bed because there's simply nothing else to do. Instead, there is just a continuous stretch of illuminated activity from morning until whenever you finally decide to turn off the last light and try to sleep. And by then, it's usually well past 10 or 11 or midnight. And you're tired, but not the deep bodily tired of someone who has worked in the fields and been in the dark for 6 hours already. You're a shallow tired, a wired tired. The tired of someone whose body has been fed light signals for hours after it wanted to sleep. And so, in the space of one generation, from roughly 1880 to 1910, electric lighting spread through the industrialized world, and biphasic sleep essentially died. Not everywhere, and not completely, but the mainstream pattern, the default assumption, the shape of a normal night as understood by an educated urban person in Europe or America, changed. By 1920, the second sleep had vanished from popular consciousness so completely that when it appeared in older literature, most readers no longer understood what it meant. Chaucer's references, Savantus's references, the casual mentions in Old English court records that had puzzled Ukach, all of it became invisible, filed away as odd archaic phrasing that scholars would have to explain in footnotes if they bothered to explain it at all. Within 2 generations of Edison's light bulb, the entire architecture of the human night had been rebuilt, and nobody remembered that there had ever been another way. I want to pause here and give you a specific number that I think really drives this home. In 1910, the average American got about 9 hours of sleep per night. In 2013, according to a Gallup poll, the average American got about 6.8 hours of sleep per night. That is a loss of more than 2 hours per night in 1 century. 2 hours, every single night, times 365 nights per year, times a lifetime. That's an enormous amount of sleep we have collectively given up, and we didn't give it up because we're better rested than our ancestors or because we discovered we needed less. We gave it up because the electric light made it possible to stay awake longer, and the culture, obligingly, told us that staying awake longer was virtuous. And so we did, and so we do. And so we are, most of us, walking around at some level of chronic sleep deprivation that we've come to accept as the normal state of being a functional adult. Now, one of the strange things about a lost thing is that even after it's lost, sometimes traces of it remain, if you know where to look. And the second sleep left traces. It left them in language, most obviously. The word curfew is still with us. The old prayer books are still on library shelves, with their nocturnal offices intact. Certain expressions still linger, half forgotten, in English and French and Spanish and Italian, referring to states of half-sleep or wakeful darkness that don't quite map onto our modern sleep concepts. And it left another kind of trace, and this one is really quite haunting when you sit with it, because this trace is inside our own bodies. Because the human body, apparently, still remembers. Even though the culture has forgotten and the historical memory has been erased and the practice has died out, the underlying biology, the ancient rhythm that produced biphasic sleep in the first place, is still there, waiting. Which brings us to a laboratory at the National Institutes of Health in the early 1990s and to a psychiatrist named Thomas Wuck. Wuck was studying seasonal affective disorder, that particular kind of depression that hits some people hard in winter and he had a hypothesis that involved daylight exposure and the length of nights. And to test his hypothesis, he designed an experiment that is, when you understand what it revealed, one of the most quietly astonishing experiments in the history of modern sleep research. Wack took a group of healthy adult volunteers. He put them in a controlled environment, and for 1 month, he gave them 14 hours of darkness every night. 14 hours. That's roughly the length of a natural winter night at northern European latitudes, which is to say, roughly the length of the night that Mugrot and her ancestors had been experiencing for their entire lives, and their parents' lives, and their grandparents' lives, going back thousands of years. And here's what happened. In the first week, the volunteers slept the way modern people sleep. One long block, 7 or 8 hours, then the rest of the time in the dark they just lay there bored or tried to entertain themselves in the darkness. But after about 3 or 4 weeks, something started to change. Their sleep patterns began to shift, spontaneously, without any instruction from Wack, without any prompting, without anyone telling them what was supposed to happen. Their sleep started to break into 2 segments. They fell asleep quickly at the start of the night, slept deeply for about 4 hours, then woke up. And instead of trying to force themselves back to sleep or feeling anxious about being awake, they lay quietly in the dark for 1 to 2 hours in a state Wack later described as, quote, non-anxious wakefulness, a kind of meditative, calm, contemplative awareness. And then they got sleepy again and slept for another 4 hours and woke with the light of morning refreshed. They had spontaneously reinvented Mugrot's night. Nobody told them to. Nobody prompted them. Their bodies just remembered. Under conditions that resembled the natural pre-industrial night, with extended darkness and no artificial light exposure in the evening, healthy modern human beings will, apparently, revert within a few weeks to the biphasic sleep pattern that dominated human history for thousands of years. It's still in us. It never went away. We just buried it under electric light and cultural pressure and the demands of the industrial workday, and we forgot it was there. But if you take those pressures away, if you give the body a proper long night of proper darkness, it will find its way back to the old pattern all on its own. I don't know about you, but the first time I read about the Wack experiment, I sat quietly for a long time thinking about it, because it changes what your own 3 in the morning awakenings mean. Let's stay with the Wack experiment for a moment, because I want to really unpack what he found, and what it means for those of us walking around in the modern world, stuck up at the ceiling at 3 in the morning, wondering what's wrong with us. Wack published his findings in 1992 in a paper with the wonderfully understated title, In Short Photo Periods, Human Sleep is Biphasic. That's the whole thesis in one sentence. Give people long nights, and their sleep breaks into 2. It's actually a very simple experimental design, and that's part of what makes it so devastating. He didn't need brain scans or elaborate equipment. He didn't need to prove some subtle statistical effect. He just changed the lighting, waited, and watched what happened. And what happened was that the ancient pattern re-emerged, all on its own, in people who had never heard of first sleep and second sleep, who thought they slept the normal modern way, who would have described themselves as perfectly ordinary consolidated sleepers before the experiment began. And there's more, because Wack didn't just observe the pattern change, he also measured what was happening physiologically during the interval between the 2 sleeps. And this is where it gets genuinely fascinating. During that hour or 2 of quiet wakefulness in the middle of the night, his volunteers showed elevated levels of prolactin, which is a hormone associated with feelings of calm, well-being, and gentle contentment. Prolactin is the same hormone that mothers produce during breastfeeding, associated with that particular state of soft, focused, peaceful presence. And under natural biphasic conditions, the human body apparently produces a surge of it during the watch, keeping the brain in a state of relaxed, meditative awareness that is neither ordinary daytime alertness nor ordinary sleep. It's its own thing. A third state of consciousness, if you like, that our ancestors experienced every night of their lives, and that most of us in the modern world have never experienced at all. Wack's subjects, when interviewed about their experiences, described the watch in remarkably consistent terms. They said it felt peaceful. They said their thoughts flowed easily and without pressure. They said they felt neither anxious nor restless, just quietly present in a way that reminded some of them of meditation and reminded others of the way they felt as small children lying in bed on a summer afternoon with nowhere to be. Several of them described it as one of the most pleasant experiences of their lives and asked, when the experiment ended, whether they could keep doing it. Which, of course, they couldn't really, because as soon as they went back to their normal lives with normal artificial light in the evenings, their sleep consolidated back into a single block within a week or two. The pattern is there, latent, always available, but it only surfaces under the right conditions. Give the body enough darkness, and it will find its way. Give it electric light until midnight, and it will do its best to compress everything into whatever solid block of unconsciousness you can manage. Now, this is the point where I want to say something honestly about the state of modern sleep science, because Akashed work and Wakha's work are influential, and they've become widely discussed, but they haven't been universally accepted. Some researchers have pushed back, arguing that the historical evidence for biphasic sleep is more scattered than Akash's presence, or that the phenomenon was less universal than his thousands of references suggest. Some point to modern hunter-gatherer societies, like the Hadza of Tanzania or the San of Namibia, where researchers have documented sleep patterns that are actually pretty consolidated, often around 6 or 7 hours in a single block, and have argued that this undermines the idea that biphasic sleep is the true ancestral human pattern. So there's a genuine scholarly debate here, and I don't want to oversimplify it. But even the skeptics generally agree on the core finding, which is that the human relationship with the night has changed dramatically over the past few centuries, that the introduction of artificial light has compressed and reshaped our sleep patterns in ways we're only beginning to understand, and that many of the things we treat as sleep pathologies in the modern world, particularly the phenomenon of waking in the middle of the night with a couple of hours of quiet consciousness before returning to sleep, may in fact be perfectly natural expressions of a very old biological rhythm, rather than something to be alarmed about. And that, honestly, is enough. You don't have to accept every detail of Akashed reconstruction of Mugrat's night to accept the deeper point, which is that we, as a species, have profoundly rearranged our relationship with darkness, and we have done it without really understanding what we were giving up. So what does this mean for you, right now, listening to this? Let me get personal for a moment, because I think this is where the practical implications actually start to bite. If you are someone who wakes up in the middle of the night, and I mean really wakes up, eyes open, mind gently ticking over, not from a nightmare or an urgent bathroom trip, but just awake at 2 or 3 in the morning, and this happens with some regularity, and it makes you anxious because you've been told your whole life that this is a symptom of insomnia, and that healthy people sleep straight through, and there's something wrong with you and you need to fix it. Well, what if none of that is quite right? What if you are, in fact, doing something your ancestors did every single night for thousands of years? What if your body is expressing a rhythm so old and so deep that it survived 150 years of cultural pressure and industrial reorganization, and is still, quietly, trying to happen inside you in a world that has no room for it anymore? Because here's the thing about the modern middle of the night waking. The problem isn't the waking. The problem is how we respond to it. Mugrat woke at 1 in the morning and she saw her husband, and she thought about her dreams, and maybe she prayed, and maybe she talked, and maybe she went to see her neighbor, and then she went back to sleep, easily and without stress. We wake at 3 in the morning, and we immediately reach for our phones, which blast our retinas with blue light that our brains interpret as sunrise, effectively cancelling our body's melatonin production and making it much harder to fall back asleep. Then we scroll social media, or check work emails, or read the news, all of which fill our minds with anxious, activating content that raises our cortisol levels and makes us feel like we need to be doing something. Then we lie there, wide awake, agitated, unable to sleep, thinking about how tired we're going to be tomorrow, which of course makes it even harder to fall back asleep, because now we're anxious about being anxious. And by the time the alarm goes off at 6:30, we've had a genuinely terrible night, and we tell ourselves it's insomnia, and we consider taking something for it, and we resent our own bodies for waking us up. But the waking wasn't the problem. The waking was the natural, ancestral rhythm doing its old thing. The problem was everything we did after we woke. And Akach himself, in interviews about his work, has said something similar. He said that when he wakes at 3 in the morning, which he does with some regularity, he no longer treats it as a problem to be fixed. He just lies there, lets his mind wander, maybe thinks about a research question he's been working on. Doesn't reach for a phone, doesn't turn on a light, doesn't do anything to signal to his brain that the day has begun. And within an hour or so, he says, he drifts back to sleep and wakes refreshed and gets on with his life. He has, in effect, reintroduced the watch to his own nights and found it to be one of the nicest hours of his day. There's a phrase for this in some of the modern sleep literature that has grown up around Akached work, and the phrase is cognitively benign wakefulness. It's a fancy term, but it points at something real. The idea that being awake in the middle of the night is not, in itself, a problem. That the human mind is perfectly capable of being gently, calmly, quietly awake for an hour or two in the dark, without spiraling into anxiety, without needing entertainment, without demanding solutions to problems. It's a skill we've largely lost, but it's a skill that can be relearned, and it turns out to be one of the most restorative things a modern person can practice. Because here's the paradox. If you fight the middle of the night waking and treat it as an emergency and try desperately to force yourself back to sleep, you generally can't, and you have a bad night. If you accept the middle of the night waking and treat it as a normal thing and let your mind wander gently in the dark, you generally, eventually, drift back to sleep on your own, and you have a fine night. The waking is the same. The relationship with the waking is what changes. Now, I want to be careful not to romanticize this too much, because there are absolutely people who have genuine sleep disorders, who experience insomnia in ways that are not just cultural msrudungs of an ancestral pattern, but actual disruptive, distressing conditions that need medical attention. And if you are one of those people, then please take your sleep problems seriously, talk to a doctor. Don't just decide that your inability to sleep is Mugrat's ancient watch trying to happen. Real insomnia exists, and it can be debilitating, and it deserves proper care. But for the great many people who fall somewhere in the middle, who sleep okay most nights, but occasionally wake at 3 and lie there fretting, or who have accepted a slightly restless relationship with the night as the price of being a modern adult, the historical perspective can be genuinely liberating. Your body is not broken. The night is not against you. And the hours between 1 and 4 in the morning are not necessarily hostile territory. They are, in fact, an old country, one your great-great-grandparents knew intimately, and you can, if you choose, learn to visit again. Now, I want to take you somewhere else for a while, because so far we've been focused pretty heavily on England and Europe and the specific pattern of biphasic sleep that Akach found in Western sources. But the story of pre-electric sleep is actually much bigger than that, and I think it's worth zooming out a bit to see what the human night looked like in other parts of the world, and how different cultures organized themselves around the darkness before the light bulb came along and standardized everything. Let's start in Japan, because Japanese sleep culture is genuinely fascinating and quite different from the European pattern we've been discussing. In pre-industrial Japan, the concept of sleep was much more flexible and much less about a single defined nighttime block than it was in Europe. Japanese homes traditionally didn't have dedicated bedrooms. Instead, people slept on futons, which are essentially thin quilted mattresses that were laid out on the tatami floor at night and rolled up and stored in cupboards during the day. Any room could be a bedroom. Any room could be a living space. The house transformed itself according to what was needed, and this fluid relationship with sleeping spaces produced a fluid relationship with sleeping times. Napping was not just accepted, it was integrated into the fabric of daily life. There's a Japanese term, inamyari, that literally translates to something like sleeping while present, and it refers to the socially acceptable practice of dozing off in public places while ostensibly participating in an activity. You could nod off during a long meeting, on a train, at a temple, in a public bath, and it wasn't considered rude. In fact, it was often taken as a sign that you were working so hard that you needed to steal these small moments of rest wherever you could find them. Which, when you think about it, is a completely different attitude to sleep than the Adasanan one we inherited in the West. Japanese peasants and merchants in the Edo period, roughly the 17th through 19th centuries, seem to have practiced their own version of biphasic sleep, though the evidence is different from the European sources. They tended to go to bed relatively early, wake for a period of activity, and then return to sleep, but the timing and structure varied a lot depending on region and profession. Fishermen in coastal villages had sleep patterns that were shaped by the tides. Farmers were shaped by the seasons. Urban merchants in cities like Edo and Osaka had lives that ran later into the evening, because Edo, incidentally, was probably the largest and most urbanized city in the world for much of this period, with something like 1 million residents by 1700, and it had a night culture that included thutas, tea houses, and other establishments that ran late by pre-modern standards. But even in the cities, the underlying pattern was one of shorter, more segmented sleep rather than the consolidated 8-hour block that would later become the modern default. Now let's swing over to the Islamic world, because Islamic culture had its own very sophisticated relationship with the night, and I think it's actually one of the most interesting cases in the whole history of sleep. Islam prescribes 5 daily prayers, and one of those prayers, called Fajr, must be performed before dawn. There's another one, called Usher, that's performed at nightfall. But there is also a highly recommended optional prayer called Tahajjud, which is performed in the last third of the night, and which requires the worshipper to wake from sleep specifically to perform it. And this practice, which has been observed by devout Muslims for over 1400 years, essentially institutionalizes the watch. It builds it into the religious life of the community. You go to sleep after Usher, you sleep for a few hours, you wake in the deep of the night, you perform Tahajjud, and then you either return to sleep or you stay up for Fajr, depending on how close to dawn you woke. This means that across the entire Islamic world, from Morocco to Indonesia, for well over a millennium, there has been a widespread cultural expectation that the pious will wake in the middle of the night for prayer, and that this waking is not a disruption of sleep, but rather a beautiful and desirable feature of a properly ordered life. The Prophet Muhammad himself, according to the Hadith literature, practiced tahajjud regularly, and there are many recorded sayings that praise the last third of the night as a particularly sacred time, when prayers are most likely to be heard. Which is, if you think about it, a version of the same intuition that Christian monks had about the office of matins, and that medieval French theologians had about Intumpuster Nox. Across completely separate religious traditions, in completely different parts of the world, people arrived independently at the same conclusion, which is that the middle of the night is a special time, a holy time, a time uniquely suited to contemplation and prayer. And Islamic scholars developed elaborate discussions of how to structure sleep around tahajjud. Some recommended going to bed very early after Usher, sleeping deeply, then waking for tahajjud, then returning to sleep until Fajr. Others recommended staying up later, sleeping for a shorter but continuous stretch, and waking just once for the combined tahajjud and Fajr prayers. The point is that sleep, in this framework, is not a monolithic block to be maximized. It is a rhythm to be shaped, with wakeful intervals built into it, exactly the way Mugrat's night was shaped, only with an explicitly religious framework rather than a folk cultural one. Now let's think about the pre-Columbian Americas for a moment, because we have some interesting evidence there too, though it's more fragmentary because so much of the documentary record was destroyed. The Aztec and Maya civilizations both had sophisticated astronomical traditions, and they both organized certain religious rituals around the middle of the night. The Aztec priests at Tenochtitlan performed observations of the stars at multiple times during the night, which means they were awake at those times, which means their sleep was structured around these ritual obligations rather than being a single consolidated block. We have accounts from Spanish observers in the 16th century describing Aztec religious practices that involved waking in the middle of the night for astronomical observation and ceremony. And while these accounts are obviously filtered through the biases of Spanish colonialism, the basic outline seems reliable. Similarly, some indigenous North American cultures had night-based religious practices that presumed the ability to be awake and alert at midnight or 2 in the morning without treating this as unusual or disruptive. The nighttime rhythm was just part of the life, part of the spiritual practice, part of what it meant to be a person in that community. The idea that all of humanity is supposed to sleep straight through from dusk till dawn is genuinely a modern industrial idea. It is not the way most humans have lived, most of the time, throughout most of history. Let me give you one more example, because I find it particularly moving. In medieval Ethiopia, in the highlands where the great monasteries of the Ethiopian Orthodox Church stood, monks developed a nightly practice of prayer that involved being awake for extensive periods in the middle of the night. Some monasteries required their monks to wake at approximately midnight and perform prayers for 2 or 3 hours before returning to sleep, then wake again for pre-dawn prayers. The Ethiopian liturgical tradition includes hymns and prayers specifically composed for these midnight offices, some of them stunningly beautiful, sung in the ancient liturgical language of Ge'ez, in candlelit stone churches that had been standing for 1,000 years. And these practices continue in some Ethiopian monasteries to this day. If you were to visit certain monastic communities in Tigray or Lalibela, you would find monks who still wake in the middle of the night to sing, who still know the watch as an intimate feature of their lives, who would find nothing strange or difficult about being conscious and prayerful at 2 in the morning. There are practicing monastic communities around the world, actually, that still preserve versions of the medieval night office. Trappist monks in Belgium and France, Benedictine communities in Germany and Italy, Coptic monasteries in Egypt, Orthodox communities on Mount Athos in Greece. These places are, in a very literal sense, living time capsules of the pre-industrial night. They still ring bells at midnight or 2 in the morning. They still assemble in candlelit chapels to sing psalms in the dark. They still know, in their bodies and their communal rhythms, what it feels like to have the middle of the night be a real place, a real time, a real feature of human life, rather than an empty gap between 2 ends of a sleep cycle. And what's striking is that people who live in these communities, when interviewed, often describe their experience of the watch in terms that match almost exactly what Wach's laboratory subjects described. A calm, meditative, quietly happy state of mind. A sense of the mind being uncluttered. A feeling that the world is very quiet and very close, that God is very close, that everything is somehow more present than it is during the noise of the day. These are people who chose their lives, who chose this rhythm, but they didn't choose it because they wanted to be historical curiosities. They chose it because the pattern feels good, because the human body, given the chance, apparently thrives on it. Because there is something about being awake in the dark that heals a particular kind of wound that modern life inflicts on the modern soul, and that we are barely aware of, most of us, until we somehow find our way back into the watch and remember what it felt like. So the picture that emerges when you look globally, across cultures, is not one particular sleep pattern that every human society had before electric light came and took it away. It's more subtle than that. It's that every human society, before electric light, had a rich, textured, culturally embedded relationship with the darkness. And that relationship was always more layered than the simple consolidated block that we now take for granted. Different cultures split their sleep differently, or interrupted it differently, or thought about it differently. But nobody, before industrialization, treated the night as an empty container to be filled with unconsciousness. Everybody treated it as a place, with its own furniture, its own inhabitants, its own things to do. And when we lost that, we lost more than just a sleep pattern. We lost a whole dimension of human experience. So let's come back to the modern world and sit with what we've actually lost, because I think this is where the story gets, well, uncomfortable in a productive kind of way. Because it's one thing to hear about Mugrot and her watch, and Tamas Wach's laboratory and Ethiopian monks, and think, oh, how interesting, what a curious historical footnote. It's quite another to actually reckon with the possibility that the way we currently sleep, the way we've all been taught to sleep, The way our entire civilization is organized around sleeping might be, not to put too fine a point on it, doing us a slow and quiet kind of harm. Let me lay out the numbers, because the numbers are pretty stark. In the United States, according to the Centers for Disease Control, about a third of adults report getting less than 7 hours of sleep per night on a regular basis. Among certain demographics, particularly shift workers, new parents, and people working multiple jobs, that number is significantly higher. Insomnia, defined as difficulty falling or staying asleep at least 3 nights per week, affects somewhere between 10 and 30% of adults, depending on how you measure it. The economic cost of sleep deprivation in the United States alone has been estimated at over $400 billion per year in the form of lost productivity, medical costs, and accidents. Drowsy driving kills thousands of people every year. Sleep deprivation is linked, with varying degrees of evidence, to increased risks of heart disease, diabetes, obesity, depression, anxiety, dementia, and a general shortening of life expectancy. This is not a minor problem. This is a major public health crisis, hiding in plain sight that we've largely just learned to accept as the normal cost of being an adult in the 21st century. And when you ask why this is happening, why we as a species are so bad at sleeping now, when we used to be quite good at it, the answers all point in the same direction. Artificial light in the evening, particularly the blue-rich light from screens, which suppresses melatonin and shifts our circadian rhythm later, making it harder to fall asleep at a reasonable hour. Work schedules that demand early morning starts regardless of when we manage to fall asleep the night before. A culture that valorizes productivity and treats rest as an indulgence or a weakness. 24-hour news cycles and social media platforms specifically engineered to keep us engaged for as long as possible, ideally right up until we collapse into unconsciousness. And underlying all of it, this deeply Adasanan assumption that sleep is fundamentally wasted time, that a good person minimizes it, and that any sleep problem is a problem to be solved with medication or discipline or the latest sleep tracking app, rather than being, perhaps, a signal from our biology that something more fundamental is out of joint. I want to talk for a moment about melatonin, because it's actually kind of remarkable when you understand how it works, and it helps explain why our modern relationship with light matters so much. Melatonin is a hormone your brain produces, primarily from your pineal gland, in response to darkness. When your eyes stop receiving light, particularly blue wavelength light, your brain interprets this as evening approaching, and it starts releasing melatonin into your bloodstream. Melatonin, in turn, tells your body that it's time to wind down, to lower your body temperature, to shift into sleep preparation mode. In a pre-electric world, this system worked beautifully because the amount of light dropped naturally at sunset and stayed low all night and rose again at dawn. Your melatonin production followed this curve exactly, and you got sleepy in the evening and woke naturally in the morning. But in the modern world, we spend our evenings under bright electric lights and stare at screens that emit exactly the kind of blue-rich light that most effectively suppresses melatonin. So your brain, chemically, has no idea that it's actually nighttime. As far as your pineal gland is concerned, you're still at high noon at 10:30 in the evening because your eyes are still receiving daylight equivalent light. Melatonin production is delayed, sometimes by several hours. You don't feel sleepy at the time you would naturally feel sleepy. You stay up later, and when you finally do go to bed, your melatonin levels are still low and your sleep is shallower and shorter than it would otherwise be. Then in the morning, when your alarm goes off, your melatonin levels are still elevated from the late-night suppression catching up with you, and you feel groggy and wretched, and you reach for coffee to override the residual melatonin, which just further disrupts the system, and so on, night after night. The pre-industrial night, whatever else it was, gave the human melatonin system exactly the conditions it evolved for. Long darkness. No blue light after sunset. A gentle rise of morning light rather than an alarm clock. And within those conditions, the biphasic pattern emerged naturally. The watch happened at its natural time. Sleep was deep and restorative, and morning felt, one imagines, quite different from the way most of our mornings feel now. This is not a nostalgic fantasy. This is what Wuck's experiments demonstrated. Give humans proper darkness, and the whole system re-regulates itself within a few weeks. The biological machinery is still there, waiting to work properly. Now, before this all starts to sound too much like a lament, let me pivot to something more constructive, because there is actually a small but growing movement in both scientific circles and popular culture of people trying to reintroduce elements of the pre-industrial night into modern life. And some of these approaches are genuinely interesting. There's the idea of controlled darkness in the evening, sometimes called dark therapy, where you deliberately reduce your exposure to bright light and screens for a couple of hours before bed. There's the use of blue light blocking glasses, which cut the particular wavelengths that suppress melatonin most effectively. There are apps and settings on phones and computers that shift the color of the screen toward warmer tones in the evening, though the evidence on whether these are actually effective is mixed. There are people who have adopted the practice of extended darkness on weekends, deliberately spending 12 or 14 hours in a darkened room to allow their bodies to reset. And there are, notably, a growing number of people who have decided to embrace their own middle-of-the-night wakings rather than fight them, treating them as opportunities for the ancestral watch rather than as symptoms of insomnia. I want to describe what this looks like in practice, because I think it's useful to have a concrete picture. Imagine you're someone who used to be a straight-through sleeper, and then over the past few years you've started waking regularly at 3 or 4 in the morning. Under the modern paradigm, you would treat this as a problem, worry about it, maybe medicate it. Under the ancestral paradigm, you would treat it as, well, just what your body is doing tonight. So when you wake, you don't reach for your phone. You don't turn on any lights. You lie in the dark for a moment, notice that you're awake, and then let your mind wander wherever it wants to go. You might think about a project you're working on. You might reflect on a conversation you had that day. You might just listen to the sounds of your house, or your street, or whatever is out there in the night. You might get up quietly, go to the bathroom, drink a small glass of water, come back to bed. If you have a partner who is also awake, you might talk quietly for a while. If not, you might read something gentle by very dim, warm light, ideally candlelight or a very low-power red light bulb, which affects melatonin less than white or blue light. And then, after an hour or so, you notice that you're getting sleepy again, and you lie down, and you drift back into sleep, and you wake with the morning feeling not exhausted but oddly refreshed. Some people who have adopted this practice report that their overall sleep quality improves dramatically, not because they're sleeping more hours, but because they're no longer fighting their own bodies. The anxiety of the middle of the night waking, which was often what was actually making it hard to fall back asleep, dissolves once you stop treating the waking as a problem. The watch becomes, in a small and personal way, a kind of gift, an hour of quiet, unstructured consciousness that no one is demanding anything from, that has no purpose except itself. Now, I want to be balanced about this, because I don't want to give the impression that everyone can just decide to sleep bafusakti and their lives will improve. Modern life makes this genuinely difficult for many people. If you have to be at work at 7 in the morning, you cannot afford to lose an hour to a leisurely watch at 3. If you have small children, your sleep is being fragmented by them, not by an ancient biological rhythm, and calling their 2 a.m. screaming your ancestral watch is not going to help anyone. If you're a shift worker, or you travel across time zones, or you have any number of other modern complications, the picture is even more complicated. The ancestral pattern is available to some people, some of the time, under some conditions. It is not a universal prescription. It is one possibility, among many, for how a human being might relate to the night. But the deeper point, I think, is not really about biphasic sleep specifically. It's about a certain humility we might cultivate about our own biological inheritance. For most of human history, in most human cultures, the night was a lived, textured, meaningful place. It had rooms in it. It had activities in it. It had a kind of quiet richness that we, in the electric age, have almost entirely paved over. And when our bodies, occasionally, remind us of that older pattern, when we wake in the dark at 3 in the morning, and our mind is calm, and our thoughts are drifting, and the world feels very quiet, we might do well not to reach immediately for the phone or the pill or the anxiety, but to just notice that we have stepped, briefly, into an older country, a place our great-great-great-grandparents knew intimately, and to see if, perhaps, we might learn to visit it again. Let's come back to Roger Akutch for a moment, because I want to give you a sense of what happened to him and to his work after that first paper came out in 2001. Because when a historian publishes something genuinely new, something that overturns received wisdom, the reaction is usually one of two things. Either the field ignores it, and it quietly disappears, or the finding takes hold, and it slowly, over years and decades, reshapes what everyone thought they knew. And in Akutch's case, it was very much the second thing. His paper landed like a stone in still water, and the ripples are still spreading. Sleep researchers started reaching out to him. Anthropologists reached out to him. Psychiatrists reached out to him. And gradually, over the 2000s and 2010s, a whole interdisciplinary conversation grew up around his work, connecting the historical evidence he had unearthed with the modern laboratory findings from people like Wack and others, and with the ethnographic evidence from anthropologists studying contemporary non-industrialized societies. His book, At Day's Close, which came out in 2005, became a foundational text in what some people now call the history of sleep as a distinct academic subfold. It has been translated into multiple languages. It has been cited thousands of times. And its central claim that segmented sleep was the dominant pattern of pre-industrial European nights has become widely, though not universally, accepted among historians and sleep scientists alike. But Akutch himself, in interviews, has been careful about the practical implications of his findings. He is not, primarily, a sleep advocate or a wellness guru. He is a historian, and his interest is in getting the historical record right. When he's asked whether modern people should try to sleep the way Mugrats slept, his answer is typically nuanced. He says that the biphasic pattern was a natural response to the conditions of pre-industrial life, and that we should not romantically try to force ourselves back into it under conditions that no longer support it. What he does say, and this is, I think, the important part, is that our understanding of what constitutes normal sleep has been narrowed dramatically by the last century and a half of industrial and electric life, and that we would do well to reopen that understanding, to remember that the human relationship with the night has been much more varied and rich than our current cultural moment suggests. There's a moment in one of his interviews that I find particularly moving. He was asked what he personally thought about when he lay awake at 3 in the morning in what he now knew was the ancestral watch. And his answer was that he thought about how strange it was to be a small human being lying in the dark, in the middle of the night, in the middle of a great historical process that stretched back thousands of years, and to be, in that moment, doing exactly what his ancestors would have done in exactly the same posture, in exactly the same darkness. That there was something continuous about the human night, he said, something that connected him to Mugrat, to Chusser's characters, to the Ethiopian monks, to the priests of Tenochtitlan, to Homer's heroes, all of whom had lain awake in some equivalent of that hour and had experienced something like what he was experiencing. And he found that thought comforting. Not sad, not nostalgic, just comforting. A small tether to a very long thread. And I think that's worth sitting with for a moment, because it's actually one of the deeper gifts of studying history properly. You realize, again and again, that you are not alone, that the things you experience, the states of mind you find yourself in, the feelings you have that you thought were unique to you or to your particular moment in history, have almost always been experienced by other human beings, many times over, throughout the long past. When you wake at 3 in the morning and lie in the dark and let your mind drift, you are not alone. You have never been alone. Millions and millions of people have done exactly this thing, in exactly this posture, in exactly this state of mind, for thousands of years before you were born. And there is something, I think, quietly healing about that recognition. The night has always had waking hours in it. The waking hours have always had thinking humans in them. The pattern is very old, and it is very good, even when it feels strange to us because we've been taught it shouldn't be happening. Let me also give you a few practical things to actually try if any of this has caught your interest and you want to experiment with your own relationship with the night. And I'll do this carefully, because I'm not a sleep doctor and this isn't medical advice. This is just some observations from the historical and scientific record that some people have found useful. First, and probably most importantly, examine your evening light. If you can, dim the lights in your home for the 2 or 3 hours before bed. Not to nothing, obviously, but to something warmer and softer than the usual bright overhead lighting most of us live under. Table lamps with warm bulbs, candles if you like them and you can use them safely, salt lamps, fireplace if you have one. Whatever gets you closer to a warm, low, orange-red palette in the evening, your melatonin system will thank you. Second, do something about screens in the last hour or two before bed. If you can eliminate them entirely, great. If you can't, at least turn on whatever warm light or night mode settings your devices offer, and consider a pair of blue light blocking glasses if you're going to be looking at screens close to bedtime. This isn't about being puritanical, it's about respecting the fact that your eyes and brain evolved for a particular kind of light exposure in the evening, and screens are giving them a very different signal. Third, if you wake in the middle of the night, try to have a plan for what you'll do that isn't reaching for the phone. Maybe you have a book by the bed, one you can read in dim, warm light without straining. Maybe you have a notebook, in case you want to write something down. Maybe you have a small candle or a very dim red bulb, so you can see enough to move around without flooding your system with white light. Whatever it is, the goal is to not signal to your brain that the day has begun. Keep the environment quiet, dim, warm, and low stimulation. Let the waking be what it wants to be, and see if you can return to sleep after an hour or so without forcing anything. Fourth, and this is more of a mindset thing than a practice, try to stop treating middle-of-the-night waking as a symptom of failure. If you're getting enough total sleep, and you're functioning reasonably well during the day, and the middle-of-the-night waking is calm rather than anxious, that is not a sleep disorder. That is possibly just your body doing something old and reasonable. Give it permission. See what happens. If, on the other hand, you're clearly not getting enough sleep, or the waking is accompanied by real distress and inability to return to sleep and daytime impairment, then yes, talk to a doctor, take it seriously. This is not the ancestral watch. This is something that needs proper care. Fifth, and this is more of a big picture thing, notice how your culture and your workplace and your family structure are shaping your relationship with sleep. And be honest with yourself about whether that shaping is serving you. Because a lot of the pressure to sleep in a single consolidated block, and to minimize sleep, and to treat sleep as an obstacle to productivity, comes not from your body but from cultural forces that were built in the last 150 years, largely by people like Udasan, who had strong opinions about what a virtuous life should look like. You don't have to accept those opinions. You are allowed to notice that they don't fit your biology very well, and to adjust your life accordingly within the limits of what your circumstances allow. Now, I want to close this section with a story, because I think stories land better than instructions. In 2014, a woman named Jessica Brunt, who is not famous, who is not a historian or a scientist, just an ordinary person who read an article about Akashed work, wrote a small blog post that got shared around a lot at the time. She described how she had been struggling for years with middle-of-the-night waking, treating it as insomnia, taking sleeping pills that made her feel groggy the next day, generally being miserable about her nights. And then she read about the second sleep, and she decided to just stop fighting it. When she woke at 2 or 3 in the morning, she stopped panicking. She stopped reaching for her phone. She started keeping a small paperback book by her bed, one she was enjoying but not desperate to finish. She would read a chapter or two by a small, warm nutlut, and then she'd notice her eyes getting heavy, and she'd turn off the light, and she'd drift back to sleep. And after about a month of this, she wrote, she realized that she had come to look forward to the middle of the night waking, that it had become her favkrata hour of the day. That she felt in that hour more herself than at any other time, and that she was, quietly, without telling anyone, one of the huppupst and best-dressed people she knew. I think about Jessica Brunt a lot, not because her story is dramatic, but because it isn't. because it's about a small, quiet, private discovery that a person can make in the middle of a very noisy world about the shape of their own night. Mugrat would have understood exactly what she was talking about. So would Chusser. So would the Ethiopian monks. So I suspect would you if you gave yourself the chance to find out. So here we are, at the end of our journey through the lost country of the pre-industrial night, and I want to spend this final section pulling together what we've discovered and offering, if you'll allow me, a kind of quiet meditation on what it might all mean. Because this story is not, I think, ultimately about sleep. Sleep is the vehicle. Sleep is the specific example. But the deeper story, the one that keeps whispering underneath all the specific historical and scientific details, is about something larger. It's about what we lose when we industrialize a fundamental piece of human experience. It's about what remains, even when we think everything is gone. And it's about the strange, humbling recognition that our bodies, and perhaps our souls, are older and stranger, and more interesting than the cultural moment we happen to be living in. Think about the arc of this whole thing. We started with Roger Akach, hunched over old documents, noticing a phrase that everyone else had glossed over. First sleep. Two small words that most historians had read past for centuries without stopping to wonder what they meant. And because Akach had the patience to stop, to notice, to pull the thread, an entire lost world came unraveling into the light. A world of biphasic nights, of the watch, of the Kavafya bell, of Mugrat slipping out onto a moonlit street to comfort a grieving neighbor at 2 in the morning. A world of nocturnal prayer, of dream interpretation, of quiet marital intimacy conducted in the dead of night on the recommendation of physicians. A world that existed, apparently, for thousands of years, that dominated the European night from at least the time of Homer through the middle of the 19th century, and that then, within 2 or 3 generations, vanished so completely from cultural memory that scholars had to rediscover it in the dust of old archives. And then we followed the mechanism of that vanishing. The coffee houses of Restoration London, staying open later than any establishment had traditionally stayed open. The oil lamps on the streets of Paris, letting people walk home at midnight for the first time in urban history. The gas lamps of the early 19th century, pushing back the darkness with an intensity that no previous generation had experienced. The factory system, which demanded consolidated sleep so that workers could stagger through their shifts. And then, finally, Uddasun and his light bulb, and the ideology that came with it, the belief that sleep was wasted time, that a virtuous modern person minimized it, that the good citizens slept in a single efficient block and used the rest of their hours to be productive. Within one generation, the entire architecture of the human night was rebuilt. And within 2, no one remembered that it had ever been any different. But then, and this is the twist that makes the whole story more than just a history lesson, we discovered that the old pattern hadn't actually died. It had just gone into hibernation. Thomas Waugh, in the early 1990s, put ordinary modern people in extended darkness, and within weeks their sleep spontaneously reorganized itself into 2 segments with a wakeful interval in between. The pattern was still in them. It had been in them all along. It just needed the right conditions to surface. And when it surfaced, it brought with it a physiological state, that beautiful prolactin-suffused non-anxious wakefulness that Waugh's subjects experienced as one of the most peaceful and pleasant states of consciousness they had ever known. Mugrat's watch, alive in the bodies of laboratory volunteers in a windowless research facility outside Washington, D.C., in the last decade of the 20th century. And around the same time, and this feels almost like a message from history, we started to see that biphasic patterns had never really vanished from all of humanity, that there were monasteries in Ethiopia and Belgium and Egypt and Greece, where monks still woke at midnight to sing psalms in candlelit chapels, that there were Muslim communities across the world where the faithful still rose in the last third of the night for tahajjud prayers, that the phenomenon we thought we had lost was, in fact, still being practiced by people who had preserved it through religious tradition and who could tell us, if we asked, exactly what it felt like from the inside. It had never been fully gone. We had just stopped looking. So what do we do with all this? What does it change, practically, in the way you live your life? Well, that depends entirely on you, and on your circumstances. If you are a shift worker with young children and 3 jobs, then honestly, probably very little. You're going to sleep when you can sleep, in whatever fragments life allows you, and the ancestral pattern is a beautiful curiosity, but not a practical possibility. And that's okay. You're doing your best. Nobody is judging you for the shape your nights have taken. But if you have any margin, any flexibility, any freedom to shape your evenings and your nights differently, then I would gently suggest that this history offers you an invitation, not a prescription, not a rule, an invitation to dim the lights in the evening, to put down the phone earlier, to let the darkness be darker, to let your bedroom be cooler and quieter than you might have thought necessary, to go to bed a bit earlier when your body is telling you it's ready. And if you wake in the middle of the night, to not treat that waking as an emergency, to let it be what it is, to lie in the dark and let your mind wander, or think about something gentle, or pray if you're the praying kind, or just breathe, and to see over time whether the shape of your night starts to change, whether you start to look forward, as Jessica Brunt did, to that quiet middle hour, whether the night starts to become, again, a place with rooms in it, rather than an empty container for unconsciousness. There's something else I want to say before we close, and this is more personal, and I hope you'll forgive the detour. There is a particular kind of loneliness that modern life produces, and it has to do, I think, with our sense of being cut off from the past. We live in a world that changes so rapidly, and that has changed so drastically from the world our great-grandparents knew, that many of us have a sense that we're floating, unmoored, in a new kind of existence that has no roots and no ancestors. The old ways of doing things are gone. The old rhythms are gone. The old wisdom feels quaint or irrelevant. And we are left with only the present, this thin, bright, flickering electric present, and we're supposed to make sense of our lives entirely within its narrow terms. And every so often we discover something like this, something like the second sleep. And it turns out that the old ways are not gone. They're inside us. They're in our bodies, in our biology, in our nervous systems. They are waiting for us to notice them. And when we do notice them, when we let them surface, we discover that we are not, in fact, unmoored. We are connected, through our bodies, to every human being who ever lived, to Mugrat in a 1690s cottage, to the priest of Tenochtitlan watching the stars, to Chusser's characters, to the Ethiopian monks, to the anonymous shepherd in the Anatolian highlands who lay awake at midnight 3,000 years ago, watching the same moon rise that we watch now. We are part of a chain that reaches back and back and back. And when we do the small human things that our ancestors did, sleeping in a dark room, waking gently at midnight, lying in the quiet without needing to fill it, we are, in a very real sense, in communion with all of them. And I think that's worth remembering. When you next wake at 3 in the morning, and the modern world tells you that you're broken and you need a pill, remember Mugrat. Remember that she woke at the same hour, in the same darkness, and treated that waking as a gift rather than an affliction. Remember Akach, patient at his archive table, uncovering the shape of your own biology from documents 400 years old. Remember Wuck's laboratory subjects, discovering ancestral peace under 14 hours of darkness. Remember that you are the inheritor of a very long human night, and that the night is not, and never was, your enemy. Roll over. Let your mind drift where it wants to go, and if you can, begin your second sleep. Good night, everyone. Sleep well, both of your sleeps if you can manage it. Lots of love to you all, and I will see you next time. Peace.